now be dismissed to our classes.
Okay. We are still in Daniel chapter 3. If I don't finish chapter 3 tonight, I'm just going to be done with it. So we'll not go on no matter what we get to. So, no. All right. I believe last week we got down to somewhere around verse 23, 22, somewhere around in there. I want to read verse 23 through the end of the chapter. It says, "And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, 'True, O king.' 'Look,' he answered, 'I see four men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the fourth is like the Son of God.' Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spoke, saying, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here.' Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, 'Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word and yielded their bodies that they should not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this.' Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon." Okay. So last week we looked at from verses 16 on. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused the king's command, not once, but twice. They refused to worship, to bow down to this golden image. We talked about how they were bound. They were there for this dedication that he called. So they were fully clothed, head to toe, had a hat on, they called it a turban, and then they bound their hands and feet. He was enraged because they had refused this. And as I mentioned last week, I think in this he was going to cause their death to be quicker than what it normally would be. He heated the furnace up 7 times hotter. They're fully clothed. And this is in my mind. Clothes are going to catch on fire. It's so hot. I mean, death is going to be pretty instant. And I think his whole point was he wanted them to suffer for disobedience. So verse 23 Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into the fire. And as this is happening, Nebuchadnezzar and his officials, in verse 24 it says counselors, but I have a footnote that says high officials. They're sitting around watching. This is a show to them. So they're going to watch these men die, burn. So verse 24, it says he was astonished. And he asks his high council, high officials, it says, didn't we cast 3 men into this fire? And of course, they answered truthfully. I mean, there was no reason to lie about it at that point. Said, yes, that's what we did. I see that as, we witnessed something happen, and we've got friends with us, and we do that whole, we rub our eyes and say, did you see this? Did this really happen? Car wreck or nowadays you see people on their phone and they fall into a hole or something, and you say, man, did this really happen? Did I really see what happened? And that's what he's doing here. He's making sure that there wasn't a fourth person that he just didn't know about get thrown in there with him. And when they say yes, well, he said, verse 25, he said, well, now, and he said, I see 4 men. They're loose, they're walking around, and they appear not to be hurt. Now, the other thing that would happen, I didn't look into this, I don't know how big the furnace was height-wise. I mean, they were bound. They didn't walk into the furnace. They were thrown in. So, if you're thrown in, you're not going to land on your feet, especially if you're bound, your hands and feet. So, you would think that there would be another injury besides the fact that you're burning. But here they are. They're walking around just like I'm pacing back and forth up here. They're not hurt. They're not screaming. They're just, in my mind, they're hanging out. Verse 26. Well, let's look Isaiah chapter 43 real quick. Isaiah chapter 43. In verse 2. We'll start in verse 1. It says, but now, thus says the Lord, who created you, O Jacob, and he who formed you, O Israel, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. The Lord will take care of His people. We talked here a couple of weeks ago, I guess, about whether Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew for sure that the Lord would deliver them from the fire as far as what He did. That verse right there, Isaiah 43, even had they physically perished, they're still taken care of. God's still going to take care of His people. Today, we're going to suffer from illnesses. In our death, we may suffer. But if we're God's people, if we've done the things that God has commanded, and we're faithful servants of God, God will still take care of us. In the same way that He would have taken care of these 3 men had they perished in the fire. Verse 26 says, Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace. The commentary that I've been reading and studying through says that they were far enough back that they probably felt the heat, but it wasn't so bad that it hurt them, that they were in any danger. But Nebuchadnezzar gets up, and it said that there was a gate that he could have went to, that's where he come up to, and that's where he says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come from the midst of the fire. He says, and they're servants of the Most High God. Do you feel like it, with that statement, is he admitting that God is the one and only? I don't. No, I don't think he is either. And we'll get down in a little bit to some other things that lead me to believe that that's not the case. All right, now I'm going to do some of my hypothetical trick questions again. Nebuchadnezzar says to them in verse 26, "Come out and come here." Could these three men have refused to come out? I mean, they weren't. Who said that? Again, that's why I say this is a trick question. I mean, it's not really trick, but it's one of my hypothetical. Y'all are all scratching your head. They weren't hurting, but could they have said, "We're going to stay here"?
Well, they could say, "You come here."
They could have. I didn't think about that.
We also know we don't need to keep depending on God either. God kept these three men safe. And then the king said, "Go on out." I don't even need to go out.
Okay. That leads into my next question. Would there have been consequences from God had they refused?
That's God that was sticking with them.
Pardon?
That's God that was sticking with them.
Well, in the end, yes.
God, we know when Christ was told to jump down, we wouldn't dash his foot. He said, "Well, we don't tempt God."
Right.
And you're right. It's a two-way question.
It's a two-way question, but I believe that he made more of an impact when they came out, and nothing was, there was smoking, there was nothing.
Yes.
That was just all they could do.
Right.
And made even more of an impact than what they had.
Yes. No, you're right. Somebody.
Part of the commands of God were for, even though the Israelites were captives, they were still to abide by the laws of the land unless those laws were in conflict of God's laws. And by Nebuchadnezzar saying for them to come out, they were obeying the king.
Right. Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. I need to get to the right chapter before I start reading. Mark chapter 12, verses 13 through 17. Here's a question about paying taxes. It says, "Then they sent to him some of the Pharisees and the Herodians to catch him in his words. When they had come, they said to him, 'Teacher, we know that you are true and care about no one.'" There's a footnote that says, "courts no man's favor." It means that he's not trying to do good for one and not for another. "For you do not regard the person of men, but teach the way of God in truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Shall we pay or shall we not pay?" But he, knowing their hypocrisy, said to them, "Why do you test me? Bring me a denarius that I may see it." So they brought it, and he said to them, "Whose image and inscription is this?" And they said to him, "Caesar's." And Jesus answered and said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God." And they marveled at him. So, tax season is upon us. So that doesn't say, well, you don't have to pay taxes because you're a Christian. We're to follow the laws of the land. And taxes, unfortunately, are part of the laws. We have to pay them. Romans 13. Romans 13, verses 1 and 2. It says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. So, when I asked would there be consequences from God if they would have refused to come out, I think there would have been. They're defying Nebuchadnezzar on a point that's, doesn't go against God's word. He's not asking them to come out. Now, if he just said, you come out and you worship this idol, been different. But he was astonished and wanted them to come out. Roger?
I think God wanted them to come out. Part of what's happening here is the glorification of God.
Right.
For them to stay in there, keep their lives, to stay in the furnace doesn't complete everything. To come out and to see and be examined like they were.
Right.
There's no smell, there's no harm, there's nothing. Proves that the God that they serve truly is what he said to them.
Right.
He's God of all.
Right.
And so I think it was for God's benefit.
Yes. It was glory to God.
The whole thing to play out like it.
Right. Right. 1 Peter 2, one more verse about 13 through 17. It says, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, and by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So, we've looked at this a couple of weeks ago, that we have an obligation to those that are our rulers. The governor, sheriff, police officers, to our bosses. We have that obligation that if we don't, and I say obey, if we don't follow what they ask us to do or what they tell us to do, then not only are we ignoring them, but we're sinning against God. We are required to, as long as it doesn't affect our worship to God, we're supposed to follow that. And I bring all that, part of that, as I bring up, is are there people today that are so against authority, but they still think they're worshiping God and following God, that they refuse to want to follow our government and follow the rules and the laws that have been set before us. And that's what they use. They say, well, it goes against my worship. Well, I don't see how it goes against worshiping God when the speed limit says 55 and you want to do 70 just because your foot's heavy. It goes against God's word. So, any questions, comments about that? Okay. And of course, I left off Acts 5:29, where they said we should obey God rather than man. So, verse 27. Get back over to Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar comes and has his high officials, those that were there for the dedication of this idol. He has them come around to investigate. Why do you think that is? I think there's a reason behind it. How many times have you seen something and you try to tell somebody about it and they say, I can't believe that. You had to be there. You had to be there to see it. You had to be there to know what happened. I think that's what he's doing. He's making sure that there's multiple people that see that, yes, I had these men thrown in the furnace, and these men come out unscathed. Not a hair on their head was singed. Nothing. Nothing burnt. Their clothes were still intact. I think as witnesses for him is what I think has happened. It shows the power of God in the fact that the only thing that I can see that burnt was their hands and feet were bound, because they were able to walk around. They were loosed, but there was nothing affected, no smell of smoke. We've probably all been around either a campfire or we've been grilling burgers or whatever at the house, and you can't walk away from that without smelling like smoke. And if you're bad like I am, you have hairs on your arms singed when the fire, this didn't happen to them. It shows to me, like I said, it shows the power of God, something we already know about, but I can't explain how impressive that is and how impressed the king was on that. Yes, Alan.
See, their bonds were burned away or something. Somehow, however they were bound, it's gone.
Right.
Released. Oh, I'm sorry, you just said
That's okay. You know me. I repeat myself, so somebody else can repeat me too. I was going to. I'm glad you said that, because I meant to talk about that and I skipped over that. I use the New King James Version, the only true version, just so you know. No, I'm kidding. And it says that in verse 25, the form of the fourth is like the Son of God. Does anybody else have... The old King James says that too, doesn't it, Todd? Does anybody have the English Standard Version? Does it say the sons of a god, or like a son of the gods? That is another verse that tells me that he's not thinking that there's still just this one God. But he does accept the fact that these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel's, his God, their God, is better than all the rest of them. I mean, he even says that in verse... What was that? Hang on, I'll find it in a minute. Oh, verse 29. It says, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. So he's not saying that this is the only God. It's just he's got more power than the gods that we serve, the gods that we worship. Okay. There's some, and back in verse 25, there was a little bit of discussion about what that fourth person or fourth image was. Does anybody have a side note or anything in their Bible or anything that says what's thought? Some of them was just an angel that was with them, but nothing that I read indicated that they thought it was the Son of God, was Christ.
All I have here is this: I see four men loose.
Yeah.
And he doesn't show any distinction. The only thing he says is, it's like the Son of God.
Yeah.
We don't know what he means by that terminology.
Right. Well, and I kind of question, how would he know what the Son of God looked like?
Well, maybe one of the gods that he served. In his.
Right.
We don't know.
Right. Well, he had to think that there was something, special about this fourth.
Well, yeah, because
None of them were affected.
Because
Right. Right. Okay. So, what does Nebuchadnezzar do? I think it's interesting. I think it's funny. The beginning of chapter 3, what's he do? He's extreme in the fact that he says, you will worship my God. You will bow down to this idol, this image. And if you don't, then you'll be put to death. And now what's he do? He goes in extreme to the fact that nobody can say anything about the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's not to the God, the one and only. It's still just the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he makes this decree that basically says that if anybody says anything amiss or against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, be cut into pieces. Their houses will be made an ash heap. I mean, there you go, the extreme again. Mike.
Anybody here get the idea that this guy's dealing with a lot of impulse issues?
Yes. I mean, pardon? He may be afraid that fourth person will show up and cause some problems.
See how it has made an impact that he doesn't want to upset this God.
Yes.
Because obviously he's powerful.
Yes. No, and I mean, but like Mike said, he has some impulse issues. He goes from one extreme to the next of, because you can look back at verse 17 or 16, verse 15, sorry. Who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Well, now he sees, oh, it's that God. Not the God, but just that one. Verse 30 says, the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. He caused them to prosper, whether it was with a true promotion of, you go from this level to this level, but they were prosperous with him. And I think that's interesting in the fact that we're going to skip chapters 4 and 5. I only have one more Wednesday night. I'll be out next week. Bruce will be teaching. And so the last Wednesday night, Lord willing, I'm jumping to chapter 6. And so I think it's interesting when we get to chapter 6, what happens to Daniel. And I think you can tie it to, I think they remember what happens in chapter 3 to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They prosper because of their faith in God. They know that Daniel has prospered because of his faith in God. So nobody else may remember, but these officials that Nebuchadnezzar had, they do. And I think they carry it over through time until, they become jealous and vindictive and try anything to get them out of the way. Comments or questions on the last part of chapter 3? Okay. Let's start out with chapter 6. Well, let's look at the last part of chapter 5. Because we go from Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 1 through chapter 4 chapter 5, we go to Belshazzar. It says Belshazzar the king. The things I read on that is he was, I believe it said that he co-reigned with his father. I'd have to get the book out to remember what his name was. I don't have it wrote down. So we go through chapter 5 with that. We get down to the end of chapter 5. Belshazzar is killed. It says, verse 30, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So here's that next kingdom after the Babylonian kingdom that takes over. So in chapter 6, it says, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. And over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole. So, here again we see this because of who Daniel was, because of what Daniel stood for. What happens to him? He is advanced now in Darius's kingdom. He had been advanced. He was promoted. He was thought highly of, wouldn't you say, with Nebuchadnezzar. So now here he is following along the same pattern. We see that in our lives, if we're at work, that's the only thing I can compare this to. This was his job to do what the king said. If we do what we're told, and we do a good job, and we strive to improve ourselves, what happens? Most of the time. I won't say all the time, because I know there are bosses that overlook stuff like that. But are we not promoted over time if we prove ourselves? This is what Daniel has done. Verse 3, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Daniel distinguished himself. Let me look at something real quick. In chapter 5 and verse 12, where it talks about having an excellent spirit in him. 5 and verse 12 says, inasmuch as an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, interpreting dreams, solving riddles, and explaining enigmas were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will give the interpretation. Daniel has been called to interpret the handwriting. Verse 4 says, so the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fault found in him. So now starts their mission. Their mission to bring Daniel down. Saved by the bell. How much jealousy can a person have to that's their goal. That's their goal. Beginning in verse 4, after the first 3 verses, that is now these men's goal, to figure out some way to get Daniel out of the picture. How much jealousy does that take? What did Daniel receive? He received something that these men wanted. The praise of the king.
They're thinking about setting him above the whole realm. So
Power.
yeah, that's what they would like.
Yep.
So if you can get rid of him.
In their minds, I think that's what they're. I think That's what they think. If we can just get rid of this, get rid of our leader, then one of us will get that opportunity. Bad thing is what happens to the next leader? I mean, the target goes on his back. So it would be a never-ending cycle with that. Okay, so like I said, I'll be out next week. Bruce will be teaching. Week after next, we'll look at Daniel chapter 6, and that'll be the last class of this quarter. So hold your applause. Thank y'all for your comments and your questions.